Stay right where you are.
The gun was pointed at a child's head, and I was the only person in that ballroom who knew how to end it without anyone else dying. 3 months earlier, I was folding towels for a woman who spat insults at me in front of 200 guests. Nobody in that room knew what I used to be. Nobody knew what I was capable of. And nobody, especially not her, knew what I was about to become again. My name is Serena Carter. This is the story of how a hotel maid nobody looked twice at ended up saving a room full of people who once looked at her like she was nothing. However you're watching this, wherever you are, however your day has gone, stay with me. I promise you this story earns every minute of your time. But let me start from the beginning. I was 28 and I had already lived 2 lives. In the first one, I served my country doing work that doesn't show up on any resume, work I'm still not allowed to talk about in detail. In the second one, I was just a mother trying to keep my son alive. Daniel was 7. He loved trains, hated vegetables, and 3 months before the wedding that changed everything, a doctor sat me down and told me his blood was turning against him. Aggressive, fast, expensive to fight. I had savings. I had a pension from years nobody could ever thank me for publicly. I spent all of it in 11 days. So I took the fastest job I could find that paid immediately. Hotel housekeeping. Nobody asks a maid for her service record. Nobody wonders what she used to be trained to do. I needed invisible. Invisible kept my son alive. I didn't know that invisibility was about to save a billionaire's life. I didn't know the woman about to humiliate me in front of everyone she knew was about to become the least of my problems. I definitely didn't know that somebody very powerful had already marked that wedding as the first move in a plan that would end with a bomb, a gala, and hundreds of children in the blast radius. But that morning, all I knew was that I had a wedding reception to clean up after, and a spilled glass of champagne was about to change my life. Damian Blackwood was the kind of man magazines wrote about without ever really knowing him. His family's business had built half the skyline in the city, and he was marrying Vanessa Sinclair, a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was the prize at the end of every room she walked into. I served drinks that night. I refilled glasses. I stayed out of the photographs. That was the job, and I was good at the job, the same way I used to be good at disappearing into a crowd for reasons that had nothing to do with hospitality. I didn't know Vanessa had spent the night before her own wedding on the phone with a man who wasn't her fiancé, begging him to change his mind about leaving her. I didn't know he'd hung up on her for the last time an hour before she put on her dress. All I knew was that she looked like she was holding something together with force, and people who are holding something together with force tend to break in public if you give them a reason. I gave her a reason without meaning to. A guest bumped my tray. Champagne went down the front of a dress that cost more than a year of Daniel's treatment. She didn't yell first. She hit me first. The sound of her hand against my face was loud enough that the band stopped playing. Then she used her mouth. She called me stupid. She called me worthless. She said the word made the way some people say something much worse. She kicked my shin hard enough to leave a mark I'd feel for days, and 200 guests watched a woman in a wedding gown humiliate a woman in a uniform, and not one of them said a word. I could have ended that moment in under 2 seconds. I knew 4 ways to do it without leaving a mark. I stood there instead because ending it wasn't the mission. Daniel's treatment was the mission. I picked up my tray. I apologized for something that wasn't my fault. I walked away with my head down, exactly like a woman with nothing to lose her temper over. The gunmen came through the service entrance 40 minutes later. There were 6 of them, and they knew exactly where the security cameras were blind. They knew the layout of the ballroom better than most of the staff did. They fired one shot into the ceiling to get everyone's attention, and 200 people who had been drinking champagne an hour earlier were now on their knees with their hands on their heads. I was on my knees too at first. That's what a maid does. That's what invisible does. Then one of them grabbed Damien by the collar and put a gun to his temple, and I heard him say a name into his radio that told me this wasn't a robbery. Robbers don't confirm targets by name before they take anyone's jewelry. I moved before I decided to move. My body remembered things my mind had spent years trying to forget. I took the nearest gunman's weapon before he understood it was gone. I put him on the ground without killing him because dead men can't be questioned later, and questioning them later was going to matter. I took the second one the same way. By the time the third one turned around, I already had his friend's weapon aimed at his chest, and something in my voice told him I wasn't a hotel employee anymore. Security finished the job once I'd done the part they weren't trained for. 200 guests stood up shaking. Damian Blackwood stood up staring at me like he just watched a ghost walk through a wall. I put the gun down on a table, picked my tray back up, and went back to clearing glasses because the mission was still the mission, and the mission had never been to be seen. He found me in the service hallway 20 minutes later. He didn't ask what I wanted or if I needed anything. He asked one question. Who taught you to do that? I told him I used to work security. It wasn't a lie technically. It also wasn't the truth, and he knew it wasn't the truth, and something in his face told me he wasn't going to let it go. Vanessa found me an hour after that. She didn't thank me for the men I'd disarmed 3 feet from her husband. She told me to stay away from him, like gratitude was a resource she couldn't afford to spend on someone beneath her. I went home that night to a sitter watching my son sleep, paid her the little I had, and sat by his bed until the sun came up, wondering how long I could keep both lives separate before one of them found the other. The second attack came 4 days later, on a stretch of road Damian's motorcade took every single week without variation. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was thinking one bodyguard in the front car was enough. I wasn't supposed to be in that car. I'd been asked to accompany a delivery of linens to his private residence, a task so far beneath what I actually was that I almost laughed when I got the assignment. I was in the back seat of the third vehicle when the first 2 cars ahead of us were forced off the road by a truck that came out of nowhere, and men in tactical gear who were absolutely not confused civilians opened fire on a car carrying one of the wealthiest men in the country. I recognized the formation before I recognized the danger. 2 shooters flanking, 1 pinning down from an elevated position, a 4th waiting for the extraction. This wasn't rage. This wasn't chaos. This was training, the same training I'd once had drilled into me on the other side of the world. I got Damian out of the second car and into cover before his own security understood what was happening. I put down the elevated shooter first because he was the only one who could hit us from range once we were moving. I bought us the 90 seconds we needed for real backup to arrive, the same way I used to buy people 90 seconds in places I'm still not allowed to name. When it was over, Damian sat on the side of that road, staring at blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, and asked me the only question that mattered. Were you? I didn't answer. But I think that was the moment he decided to find out for himself. What he found took him 3 weeks and cost him favors he never explained to me. He found records with my name on them that had been sealed for reasons of national security. He found operations I'd been part of that saved lives no news outlet ever reported. He found a woman who had given 15 years of her life to work that would never earn her a single public word of thanks, work that ended not because I stopped being good at it, but because Daniel got sick and there was no version of that life that let me be both a soldier and a mother who was actually present. He also found something else. He found that in the 11 days after my son's diagnosis, I had liquidated every account I had. My pension, my savings, a retirement fund I'd built for 15 years. All of it gone into a single line item, pediatric oncology. He asked me why I never told anyone. I told him the truth. Nobody asks the woman changing their sheets what she's sacrificing to be there. And I never wanted anyone's pity to be the reason my son got to live. That was when he told me the truth he'd been keeping from everyone else. The attacks weren't random. They were the opening moves of a war that had been building for years, tied to something his late father had done in the earliest days of building the family's empire, a debt owed to people who don't forgive and don't forget. He told me he suspected someone close to him, someone who had access to his schedule and his security details, was feeding information to the people trying to kill him. He told me he didn't know who to trust anymore. Then he asked me to help him find out before more people died. Vanessa noticed the change in him before I did. She noticed the way he started asking for me by name in rooms where I had no business being asked for. She decided, the way people like her always decide, that the problem wasn't the assassination attempts on her husband's life. The problem was the maid stealing his attention. She humiliated me twice more in the weeks that followed. Once in front of the household staff, once in front of guests at a private dinner where she made sure everyone at the table understood exactly what she thought I was worth. I let her. Every minute she spent focused on tearing me down in a dining room was a minute she wasn't asking questions about where I disappeared to at night, questions that would have gotten both of us killed a lot faster than her cruelty ever could. What she didn't understand, what she never understood, was that her hatred was doing the enemy's work for her. Every distraction she created was a blind spot the real threat could move through. I let her keep creating them because right up until the very end, I needed her exactly where she was. It took another 6 weeks to find what we were looking for. Financial trails hidden behind shell companies. Communications routed through a household staff member who had been selling Damien's schedule for 2 years to people who used it to plan 2 attempts on his life and were now planning a third, one far larger than the first 2 combined. The target was a charity gala. Political leaders, judges, executives, and 200 children from a foundation supporting kids who had survived exactly what my son was still fighting to survive. The first 2 attacks hadn't been the plan. They'd been distractions, small enough to be dismissed as isolated incidents, designed to keep everyone's attention away from what was actually coming. I had 1 week to stop it, 1 sick son at home, and 1 decision to make about whether the woman I used to be was allowed to come back one final time. I chose to go back. The night of the gala, I moved through that building the way I used to move through buildings where the wrong step meant someone didn't come home. I found the explosives before they were fully armed. I found 3 of the men placing them before they knew I was in the room. I evacuated 200 guests through service corridors most of them didn't know existed, moving fast, moving quiet, buying seconds the way I'd bought seconds my entire career. I stopped the 4th man from detonating what was left of the device with 11 seconds on the clock, because I put myself between him and a child who had frozen in the middle of the room instead of running, a boy who reminded me so much of my own son that some deeper part of me stopped calculating risk and started calculating what I was willing to survive without. I didn't survive it. I want you to know that I don't regret it. Not for 1 second. Not for 1 breath. Every choice I ever made came down to the same question, whether one more person got to go home to the people who loved them, and that night the answer was yes. All of them went home. Every single one. My last thought wasn't fear. It was my son's face and a promise I needed someone to keep for me. I asked Damien for one thing before I stopped being able to ask for anything at all. I asked him to make sure my son grew up knowing his mother never stopped fighting for him, not for 1 single day of his life. He kept that promise and everything that came after it. The country that had classified my service for 15 years finally told the truth about who I was. Medals I never asked for were placed on a coffin in front of thousands of people who hadn't known my name a month earlier and would never forget it again. Reporters who had once written stories about a billionaire's wedding now wrote stories about a woman who spent her life saving strangers and never once asked to be seen doing it. Damien adopted my son. He paid for every remaining round of treatment until the day the doctor said the word every parent waits their whole life to hear. Clear. He raised Daniel the way he promised he would, not as an obligation but as his own. He built a foundation in my name, one that pays for treatment for children whose parents can't liquidate a pension to save them, one that supports veterans whose service will never make the news, one that makes sure the next quiet person carrying an impossible weight doesn't have to carry it completely alone. He also found out, not long after, exactly what Vanessa had done the night before their wedding, and exactly why her cruelty toward me had never really been about me at all. He ended the marriage the moment the truth was undeniable. His mother years earlier had quietly placed the family's fortune into a trust Vanessa's name was never on, so when the marriage ended, so did every plan she'd built around his money. Damien sold the house that had never really felt like a home to him. He moved somewhere quieter with my son, somewhere with more grass than glass, and started building a life around the kind of quiet, unglamorous decency that used to get overlooked at every party I ever worked. I never got to see Daniel grow up. I never got to see him hit double digits or graduate or become whatever kind of man he's going to be. But I know he's loved. I know he's safe. I know somebody kept their word. And if there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. The people who change everything rarely look like they're capable of it. They serve your drinks. They fold your towels. They stay quiet through humiliation you'll never understand the weight of, because somewhere else, someone they love is worth more to them than their own dignity in that moment. Not every hero wears a cape. Some of them wear a uniform nobody looks at twice, right up until the night the world needed them to be more than invisible.